It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future. Hey everybody, welcome to The New Next. That's right, it's your friend Eeyore. I'm just kidding. Eeyore doesn't have any friends. Thanks for noticing me.
That's hilarious.
Oh, that's so funny.
What have you been
Sounds
doing?
excellent. TTFN, ta-ta for now.
What have you been doing in improv lately, Mike?
Basically, for the month of June, I not finished. We have one of my troops' first official performances Friday night.
Sweet.
And I'll be doing tech. And then my other troop, the one that's a D&D tabletop fantasy group, will be performing next Friday night. And I will actually be performing in that one. And this Saturday, I'm auditioning for a class/troop. If you get into the class, it automatically becomes a troop, and you get
Sweet.
like 8 primetime shows that are pretty much going to be sellouts because you're paired with another group who always sells out.
Yeah.
So I know they accepted, I think, 8 or 9 this past year, and I didn't make a cut. So I'm hoping this year it's a little bit different.
That's interesting. So it's like as I'm like involved in, I don't know, youth development stuff, and I guess like you are too. It's just like naturally something that happens. But this is almost like an apprentice program for you, but with improv, pretty much, right?
Yeah, it has a lot of similarities. In Chicago, at least the big theaters, I don't know about the smaller ones because there's 3 big ones, and then there's about, 30 smaller ones across all of Chicago, which I think sometimes I even forget how big Chicago, the city, is. It's not uncommon for it to be an hour drive from the top of the city to the south part of just the city, not talking about suburbs or anything. And I've gotten spoiled because places like Dallas, you can still drive the whole city in less than 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Unless you're just being stupid or something.
The whole Dallas-Fort Worth metro.
That one would be closer to an hour, but yeah. So what happens is once you finish a certain level, if you want to do higher work, you basically get in a group, or you sign up for a class, and everybody in that class is your group for the next 2 years if you decide to continue. And of course your group can fall apart and stuff, but by that time you're usually dead serious, like you're really interested in this stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure.
It's cool because you have a brand identity and like a team name. So you can, I think a lot of people think more in concepts. Like you were a Dallas Cowboys fan, right?
Yeah, technically still am.
Yeah.
I just don't really watch football anymore.
Yeah. For me, even though I didn't go to the University of Washington, I had that whole experience of growing up right next door and selling parking, having season tickets for years, going to the game. And it's it's cool to have your small identity part of a larger identity.
Yeah.
Set around values.
And even if you're someone that's not necessarily a fan of football or even University of Washington, it's still part of what that identity for that little area is and stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not really a Husky, but I kind of like purple and gold anyway.
Yeah. And I think that's some of the trouble that we have with politics sometimes is because it's like it's either yes or no, and it's two extremes. But when you really break it down to the granular levels, like everybody pretty much believes in the same things, but goes about it different ways. Like a rural versus city divide. It's like University of Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State. There's always this rivalry to it as undertone that carries so much history and values, and also, I guess, stereotypes with it too.
Yeah, it is formational. To us versus them is a very formational quality that, like, a lot of social scientists say are necessary, because if it's one of the few ways that you explore boundaries is knowing that's not what we do, that's something that they do and stuff.
Yeah.
The problem is that when identity gets so wrapped up into that, like specifically most of these things, I actually have
Hitler.
I was going to go a little bit lower key, but yeah, I like Hitler.
Yeah. Burning books and killing people.
Again, I was going a little bit lower thing. I was going to say, like, at Improv, it's a fairly liberal, especially for Oklahoma. It's among the more liberal kind of area. So I always fit in weird over there, because there I would probably be seen as ultra conservative, even though I'm definitely not.
Weird.
But there's a guy. Go ahead.
I don't really. It's weird because I feel like you're very liberal, and I think, or I don't know, if someone asked me to put you in a box, I'd probably put you in a different box than you probably are, because I think a lot of people, both of the sides, pretty much believe in the same shit. There's just a lot of cultural framing to it.
I like to put myself as close to the middle as possible.
Yeah.
It also makes me feel more different being right in the middle, because I do try my best to listen to both sides and stuff. But there's this other guy, apparently I went to high school with too, I didn't even know it, who has been a part of Improv for a while, and dude's hilarious. He does stand-up comedy and stuff as well, but I guess he posts a lot of memes on Facebook, and I always took them to be satirical. Not that I really cared, because
what type of memes?
They're mostly ones that have Trump involved. I always look at him as very satirical, because of the majority of what he posts seems to be more towards the liberal lens. And so I think of the ones that he posts that are more right-wing-esque or right is more of a satirical kind of look, especially because of his type of humor. He's a very dry, it seems to fit, but they're like, he posted
like a Colbert almost.
Yeah, but the dude, I'll have to find a clip or something and show you at some point, because just how he talks, I'm like, hey man, how you doing? And he's like, I'm doing good. How are you doing? And yeah, it's very much like that.
Yeah.
You have to really listen sometimes to hear the humor, because his voice is it doesn't have a lot of range. Like, we did an exercise once which expresses your range, like when you're angry, when you're happy, when you're sad. And he has to mostly do it with his words, as opposed to, so he'd be like, I'm really sad, I'm really mad, I'm really glad, I'm really afraid.
That's probably something I deal with sometimes too.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
But he posts things to me, and I don't really care. I have friends on both sides I've got trumpets as friends, I've got clarinets as friends, I've got bass drums as friends.
You're going to have to explain that.
It's more of a joke, because a lot of people that are Trump supporters will call them trumpets. So I was just saying, as opposed to a trumpet, awesome. A clarinet, and bass drum, like they beat to their own beat and stuff.
Like a claret, like a fine wine.
Yeah, claret. I don't know. A bidenet. I'm a bidet.
Oh my god. Yeah.
Like, I can make jokes about that, like, on both sides, and it's not a big deal. But this group I was with, they were really like, no. And I was like, would that really keep you or change your perspective on him if he happened to be a Trump supporter? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, just curious, why? And they said, because Trump says a lot of evil things that physically hurt me. And I'm like, so Trump, what do you mean? He's the supporters of Trump. They don't just say what he says, they take it and do very physical kind of things. I'm like, okay, what? Because I don't buy most people. And I'll give an example of a friend on the other side completely. He started posting a lot of anti-trans stuff on Facebook over the past couple months.
Yeah.
And One of them was specifically like, I really don't care, but if they keep shoving it in my face, then I'm going to say something about it. And and he's one of those kinds of guys. He grew up in a similar history of me as far as like the church and stuff and the type of church. And I know he's very much a Trump supporter and he's very conservative and stuff. I was like trying to find out, like, did they really get in his face, or did he see somebody or somebody walk down the street with a sign says trans rights or something, and he took that as being shoved in his face? And I was like, hey, can you give me an example of like how they've shoved it in your face? And he's like, they're just everywhere. And I'm like, what do you mean? There's trans people everywhere, or they're supporters, or what? And I was like, no, they just get in my face. Like he wouldn't answer it. And I'm like, okay, I'm really sorry that happened to you.
So my opinion on this is I agree with everybody in a lot of aspects, but really the outcome is I think everybody wants to protect children from their own fears, not what the kids are afraid of. And when you project your fears in such a weird, crazy way, like the kids tend to do the exact opposite. So I do believe, like you can just look at the numbers of all the kids transitioning at very early ages. Like it's dramatically up, but like from someone that grew up around trans people as a child and stuff like that. Like I grew up in Broadway, essentially on Capitol Hill, and if I probably be perfectly honest, the gay couples that lived around me that I knew were probably the only really stable relationships that I knew growing up. And it was just a weird experience. But there is weird shit. And trying to say that trans people as a whole, some people are just born trans or hermaphrodite or whatever you want to call it. It's not even just really a weird thing.
After talking to him, basically I came to the conclusion, which is not too dissimilar from the conclusion of these people at Improv, that really you hit it on the head, is that they're afraid of stuff. And so they project that if they're afraid of it, then they must be dangerous, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm 99% sure this dude has never had a trans person get into his face to talk about trans rights. One, because I hang around, I shouldn't say I hang around, I'm around enough people who definitely identify, I say identify, who are trans, that they have never brought it up to me ever, except whenever I post something that says something along the lines of
they just want to be accepted.
They really do.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
There's this one person who, when I first met them, they were a lady. Then they're going through transformation. Then they wanted to be identified as male. And now they're like, I don't care, because I don't know if it's, I don't know what the reasons are, but I know that they're very much more fluid than a lot of others. But I like what you said. I look at it that they're people. But some of the remarks specifically of the friend or the people who were anti-Trump, they're like, my parents believe that same kind of crap and stuff. And I'm like, okay. And my parents have said really horrible things about gay people. I'm like, okay. And I'm gay. I'm like, okay. But were they not already like that before Trump? Like, is Trump the reason why? And they're like, no. But
Trump's just a narcissist, but like hardcore. And
Trump's not anti-gay either. That's one of the things that I always find.
He loves gay people. He's probably gay himself too. I bet he's fucked dudes before. Excuse my language, but I guarantee you. Yeah. So
I'm not really worried about that part as much, but it's more of a thing. But the rhetoric that he provides, and since most of the people who are his supporters are ones who have generally at least been outwardly anti-gay,
Historically, though, if you look at a lot of those characters in political positions, they end up getting outed as gay themselves.
Oh, I know.
I'm just saying
I learned that a long time ago as a pastor, that be very careful what you rail against, because I made sure not to rail against anything and to try to be understanding. That way, my sin is just being understanding. Darn me. No. I railed against those who are not understanding.
Yeah.
But even then, but I get it. I'm not going to, the person, I can't imagine what it's like to be unaccepted by your parents. I don't have a way of understanding that.
Yeah.
And I know Brenda and I have done everything possible to make sure that my daughter, whatever happens in her life, that she always knows that she's loved. And if she ever comes out or becomes a Republican, or we find out she's not really ours, she's an alien, we make sure she knows she's loved. And that's our number one focus as far as parents go.
Species. You're like the happy version of Species.
I saw this little bit from Patton Oswalt, which I'm not really a huge fan of his stand-up. And this
I
is,
like
again,
Patton Oswalt too.
I like his political commentary a lot, but I'm not really a big fan of his comedy itself. But he had this bit that he said, all of you are cheering me right now because I'm pro-gay, I'm pro-trans, I'm pro all this stuff. But the thing is that it's all by perspective. In 30 years or something, I'm going to be like saying something like, man, I don't know, man. I'm just not for clones. And you guys are always like, how dare you be anti-clonist? And he's, you know what? Screw you. Screw all the clones. And they'll be like, oh, we hate you. And I think that's definitely true of media, because I've seen so many people who have embraced. I hate the fact that this person now causes a different kind of uncomfortableness around a whole group of people than what she originally caused. But J.K. Rowling, I remember when the biggest problem was that she was bringing witchcraft everywhere. That was the thing. And then when they found out Dumbledore's gay, it's, oh no, she's promoting homosexuality. And then she makes some statements, and all of a sudden she's this evil person who, and I get it, whenever your heroes do something that seems to go against how you think they would act, I get the disappointment. And I've had that myself with some people.
But it's the person's attachment on a hero identity. And I think you love superhero movies. I'm not a superhero person because I don't know. It's just, I think you're a superhero. You're wearing a Superman shirt right now. And
it fits.
and it's like, there's a lot of, I have a podcast that talks about the greatness in ordinary people. And that is extraordinary in itself. It's cool. But I don't know, this just popped up in my mind, but this was 2000, let's see. So the Earth Liberation Front, when we were kids, and the Animal Liberation Front, like firebombed some research projects at the University of Washington. And this was an interesting experience growing up, because they were targeting genetically engineered poplar trees at the UW. And then it ended up destroying tons of other research projects and wetland restoration and endangered stickweed plants. And then there was a example, one of the people that was on, I remember, like I've been involved like in marine development for a long time. A long time ago, there was a guy that actually fought our development of our marina, which improved the water quality dramatically. And then years later, he got caught basically trying to sink his boat that was filled with oil because he didn't want to pay to dispose it. So he was just going to essentially create a natural disaster because he didn't want to pay for it. And I think a lot of...
That's actually a really prescient line right there. Someone was going to create a natural disaster What'd you say right after that?
Because they didn't want to pay for it.
Because they didn't want to pay for it. That's a great line.
And there's a lot of these hucksters out there, and I consider, I don't really have any issue with Trump supporters at all, frankly, unless they're doing like bad things, but I just don't really get it. So I don't like the guy, and I think it's very unfortunate that we're in a situation where I feel like he's harnessed people's energy. So let's see, how do you think about this? Like I very rarely read the news anymore, because when I pop it open, I see crazy stuff. And there was like I don't even know where it was. It was just a picture. It was probably in Reuters or something, or I don't know. But you just open up a website and you're just like, first thing you're just like, oh my gosh. But it was a school board meeting or something, and two sides showed up and then they fought each other. And so this happens a lot. This is a little tangent, but related. This happens a lot with like meth heads, where they'll go try to steal wire and it will be electrified, and all that energy gets inside your body and it has to escape. So it literally blows a hole in your body and it escapes. And I feel like we're at a time like that too, where these people are all wound up, and there are resources that could be harnessed in a positive way, but it's a choice that each of them has to make personally on a one-to-one level, whether or not they want to show up and fight each other over ridiculous stuff, potentially get arrested, and not be around their kids to supposedly protect their kids, or find a way to be, nobody really has any good answers, but more participatory in their day-to-day lives. So it's just not really, let's see, maybe I think it puts a lot of pressure on the teachers if there's an expectation that they're just supposed to like teach your kids how to be good kids, because you don't want to be a quality member of society yourself.
Yeah.
And I understand like a lot of people have drug issues and stuff like that they can't really help, but that kind of, I think, maybe puts the responsibility on the rest of us that have our stuff somewhat together to try to be a good example, both to like our homies, but also our kids, about where does this action get there. I understand why people are in gangs. It's for protection. But I don't understand
And
why
identity.
people do. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But I don't understand. Yeah, maybe this is identity. That's a great point.
But you don't understand.
No, I didn't understand why you would show up at a school event, but I think that's a good point. It is an identity. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things I think and I didn't do it on purpose. I was studying religion. I was studying philosophy. I enjoyed sports, and I quickly understood. There's a book called Nature and Doctrine by George Lindbeck. It's a horrible read, but some really good points, especially in his first two essays, because people who teach at Yale, they do not write chapters, they write essays on similar subjects and place them together. But George Lindbeck wrote this great thing, and now he was talking about religious identity, of how the world, and he's fighting a specific doctrine that plagued Yale Yale Divinity School in the 1960s and 1970s, which is the liberal project, or the
which, can I stop for a second? Yale Divinity School is
theology.
literally it is the shit. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's like the great pyramid of theology.
For non-reformed theology, it's historically, especially throughout the mid 80s or so. But I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. In it, he offers a coin, the modern project. That's what it's called, the modern project. And this is one reason why I believe in postmodernity, and why I actively embracing a postmodern mindset, is the modern project is on one side of the coin, you have liberalism, and on the other side of the coin, you have fundamentalism. But they're exactly the same thing. They're just completely different directions. Specific argument he was trying to make in the first essay, because he's from Yale, is that fundamentalist, and it's an unfair thing because when I'm saying fundamentalist, I don't mean what we call someone as a fundamentalist today, though that is a part of fundamentalism. But a fundamentalist believes that everything is more or less logical, reasoned. So there's a cognitive, propositional outlook on life, and that everything has to be cognitive. And I always call them cog props for short, because we didn't have to write out cognitive propositional 20 times in a paper.
Yeah.
Liberal experience, or so the reason why something is true is because it's always true. You have to find the right proposition, and as soon as you find the right base, then you can build your building. So that is I don't want to say conservative, but philosophically speaking, that is the fundamentalist project, part of modern project.
Yeah.
The liberal project is an experiential expressive, that everybody shares the same experience, but expresses it in different ways. So this conservative liberals would when you start putting politics and stuff involved,
it's so difficult to
because what I always grew up thinking a liberal is those Assemblies of God, the Pentecostals, those are so liberal. But that's not liberal. That is actually very conservative. Episcopals can go more in that direction, but a liberal understanding of theology means that you don't necessarily believe in a God at all.
Yeah.
It just means that God is the best representation to express the experience of something spiritual or godlike or whatever. So most people who have grown up in America under religious tutelage have grown up in a cognitive propositional with maybe with a little bit of experiential expressive squeezed in. But we always talk about God in a very experiential expressive way, except when we're trying to prove God. And then we would talk about God in a cognitive propositional way. And what Lindbeck said that this is the failure of the modern project is that both of them. So for cognitive propositional, you have to find the ultimate foundation to build everything on. But the problem is that every foundation is built upon something else.
Yeah.
It's a never ending thing. And what's his name? Martin Heidegger spends a lot better time of trying to assimilate all that in language that no one understands. Jacques Derrida does a great job of kind of explaining.
Derrida's,
well, all we have to do is find the turtle, and then we can solve everything else. But the problem with liberals, though, is that, at least in Lindbeck's mind, and also from people from the Yale School of Thought on this, is that not everybody is convinced that we all share the same most primal experience.
Yep.
And if anything is different, then it automatically defeats everything else, because that is the cognitive proposition. That is the foundation for liberal, is that we all have to have shared the most basic experience, that we just express it differently. So Lindbeck offers what's called a cultural linguistic perspective, or I call it the Col-Lin, because again, I don't want to type out cultural linguistic. Experiential expressive was X, by the way, XP. And the cultural linguistic is that we learn and we base reality on the culture we're in or on the language that we participate in. This is one of my biggest reasons why I've wanted to learn more languages, but I didn't do it, because every time you learn a new language, no matter what language you started with, you learn a whole lot different picture of how life is, even though it's being described exactly the same way by two people that are basically the same. One's saying it in French, one's saying it in English. But the way it's described, the way you understand it, the reality base of it is completely different from a French perspective than an English perspective. And an Italian perspective is completely different than French, even though they're both from Latin origins. No matter how close you get, they're still completely different.
It's funny, like the people, like say someone, let's use me for example. My last name's Jensen, which comes from Jens' son, or John's son. That's the derivation from it. And it's basically a third of Denmark has this name, basically. Or Barber I'm sure that there's not a lot of people that ever thought to think that, oh, maybe my last name is that because someone in my family was a barber 1,000 years ago. And I think that there's like with, like you say, the linguistic stuff, because I talked a little bit about with you about doing more of my genealogy stuff. And one of a good example is, let's see, who is he? We're talking about like controlling language in a way and framing language. Second. Well, one of my like great grandfathers is like the King James, and it's like one dude a long time ago decided that he was going to take out my favorite parts of the Bible and then put it in some other book, and it was a way for him to frame the language that supported him at the time. And I think one thing that we've talked a lot about in the past is that, and one thing I learned too going through and studying scripture as a class, is that there's a lot of conflicting information in it. And that's okay. With me, at least, I got so much just talking about different people's interpretation from their experience, even as a high school kid with someone who was a former nun walking through it, goes that it's a cool thing to go through it. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately from some of the stuff that I'm working on. But Gutenberg, like I believe we've talked about it on this podcast before, but Gutenberg came up with a printing press, and that was a way to democratize data, which is essentially language and symbols, in a way that could be done cheaply enough and shared broadly, where ideas could be shared across the populace. And like even that show Bridgerton with, I don't know if you've seen that, but
no, I'm not generally into that English crap like that.
yeah, I just like it because there's Benjamin Franklin was Silas Dogood before he was Benjamin Franklin. And one of the main characters in that show Bridgerton is the kind of like the female version of Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, cool.
Where she's this supposedly fancy insider and stuff. And she is a fancy insider, but she's the young, unexpecting kid that nobody expects. That is Sarah Dogood in the situation. But where am I going with this? But yeah, were you about to say something?
What we're talking about, and I think this is tying into what you're trying to say, is that seeing something from another perspective really shapes your culture, shapes your language of how we see the same thing.
Yeah.
And one of the things I liked specifically, and Lindbeck is the only one of all the Yale, they call it the Yale thought, but like my favorite ethicists and theologians, all of them came from Yale and studied under Lindbeck and a guy named Hans Frey, who really shaped stuff going forward for my kind of perspective, which is great on so many different other levels. But Lindbeck offers this one thing, and a few people pick up on it, but they don't do it as well as him. In a culture or in a language, and I understand culture better than I understand language, so I'm not going to speak from the language perspective as well, but I believe it's also true. You have no reason to change what you're doing in culture. Whenever they say this is wrong, you have no reason to change. And if you think about almost every single book that talks about somebody who is tired of the way the culture is and they want to change, there's always one thing that happens, an anomaly that somehow gets into the culture, and most people just swat it away to try to just not have to think about it, but it affects somebody in the books and the stories and stuff. And once it affects them, they can't stop thinking about, but how, why? They focus on that anomaly where everybody else is get back to life. Just do what you're supposed to do and everything's going to be fine. And when an anomaly hits the system, if you recognize the anomaly and you don't just think it's a fly to bat around, the anomaly changes you and forces you to at least realize there is something else outside of what you know that is also correct.
Yeah.
And it's, and
I
then, yeah, go ahead.
I feel like I try to be that anomaly in practice, and it's it can be very, I don't know, it's crazy basically. But
Yeah.
like in a business situation, if someone's, I'd say, overly dominant in a way that nobody can share their opinion and they're running it down into the ground, the only way sometimes that is solved is by someone in a room with them and the other people that they're holding back and asking questions and then being like, y'all are the fucking problem right there. You're the motherfucker that's holding all these people back. And but it's also costing you money and screwing you over. And to let's see what I was, so I think a lot of maybe public shaming and stuff is good somewhat in some aspects, but not generally good. Sometimes you just have to pull off the Band-Aid and be like, this is fucking crazy. And
Yeah.
how do we, let's just acknowledge what reality is. It's crazy. And then jump in the deep end and then swim out. Let's figure a way to get out immediately.
And shaming someone in public is effective for 1 through 3, like in the generations or the fourth turning. The fourth generation starts to say, wait a minute, that's not right.
Yeah.
Like everybody else feels
that's our
it.
generation, or
Well,
my generation especially.
I was going to say it's Generation Z actually right now. I think millennials. Oh yeah, that's right. Millennials are the fourth generation. Yeah. So sorry. So Generation Z, if this holds true, and we won't know for a while, but Generation Z is going to bring out a different kind of shaming that will be accepted, and everybody will accept it. But that, I mean, that's the reason why both Trump and Biden are getting such strong responses. Hillary before that. Obama, it's a little bit more difficult because there's some other things tied into it, but Bush, Clinton, all these guys are get a lot of their pushback because they were doing the shaming is the exact same kind of shaming. There's a little bit more passion maybe with Trump, but they're still playing this game that, hey, back when I was a kid, back when I was a teenager, this was an okay thing to do. And now it's, wait a minute, what is it?
Do you want to hear a crazy story about this?
Maybe.
So,
but before you do, I was just gonna say there's somebody, like, I hate hearing these stories about celebrities or famous people about what they did when they were a kid or a teenager, especially if it was back when there was no social media, that they're like, oh, how can you support this person who used to do blah, blah, blah? And I'm like, they were freaking 5 years old. Everybody, you can't.
They raised their hand when they were 5 years old, and therefore they're a Nazi.
I don't think it's ever good to judge people based on the worst thing they've ever done. And now, if they consistently do bad things, that's one thing, or things that are improper for this culture. But go ahead and tell your story.
I was just first up that popped up thoughts. I just really quick thought. I feel that because you talked about a lot of politicians, I feel that they're the extreme barometer of our fears as a society, and they're just generally a lot of the conversations that and fights that happen in politics are literally the same fights at the country clubs, and they don't happen anywhere else because those people have a life of leisure where they can sit around and complain about stuff that doesn't really matter. Like that. And
I can see that.
I think it's unfortunately not, I'm not saying like the younger generations, but they've recognized it, in my opinion, overseas better than they have in the US. But it's just a totally transition point. I think a lot of the boomers and my feelings on Biden. I think he's highly corrupt. And I've always thought that. I was very disappointed that he was even talked about running for president, and he's super old. And then same with Trump. It's like you have all this baggage with him too. There's hundreds of thousands of business people that are better business people than him and are not narcissists and are more qualified to be president. And if it wasn't such a grinder where you needed basically to throw an atom bomb
that is
to
how
win.
Trump and Biden met each other for the first time on Grindr.
Yeah, I bet they did. It
was huge.
It's just it's just weird. Like it's so weird to me that they're reflective of a type of social society structure that we lived in 40 years ago, but they're expected to lead us to the future. It's weird.
They're leading based on what they know, and I don't want to rip that completely apart. So in the second essay from George Lindbeck, and I haven't looked at this book in at least 10 years. I'm trying to see if it's on my shelf right now. It should be, because I hate it so much. I've read that book more times than anybody ever should, which was like 7.
That's good.
I'm sure it's on there. If it's not, enough of it's been burned onto my heart in a way that my heart is scarred forever. But he talks about community of reference, which I know you've heard me use a lot of times since you've known me. I've probably used that a lot more than I've used some of these other terms. But he starts off, and you have to remember, this book was written in 1973. So this is not a book that came out in the 80s or 90s where this answer would be completely different. But which side of the street is it wrong to drive on? And of course, almost all the people who are buying this book are Americans. And they're like, well, obviously it's wrong to drive on the left side of the street, because that's a cognitive propositional way of thinking. It's always right to be in the right lane. He said, well, what if there's what if a street is partially closed down, or there's a car crash or something? Is there ever a time it's okay to go to the left lane if you're not British? And it starts playing with your mind a little bit, but no, it's still wrong to drive in the left lane. And in fact, I can speak for this as a former driver license examiner, that we've had people fail the test because a car was parked and the student refused to go around it because they'd have to cross the double yellow lines. The thing is, the only way they can move forward is either wait maybe 2 hours for this guy to come back in his car or to go around. And so I know I've never had that problem, because
that's crazy.
But I do know enough other examiners that have had the issue where the student was so afraid to cross the double yellow lines because it was an illegal action. So there is some truth to this that speaks beyond just my personal feelings towards it. But then he says, like, after he asks a couple questions and stuff and kind of like messes with you, then he takes the British approach. But is it ever okay to drive on the right side of the road? And everybody's, of course it is. Oh, I see what you did there. Now, the unfortunate thing is the next 3 or 4 essays that he wrote in the book didn't really close up some thoughts, because then again, they weren't chapters, they were essays.
Yeah.
But some of his students took what he did and moved it along the line. And it got down to the point where one of my professors in particular, Steve Green, now again, he was doing this specifically for theology, specifically for the purpose of understanding how people become a part of the church and the cycles they go through.
Interesting. That's super interesting, actually.
And this is actually, goodness, and I have this right here.
Will you send me some of just his name afterwards if I forget to ask you?
Yes, Green hasn't written anything, but I can definitely send like Lindbeck and some of his students and stuff. James William McClendon, who taught at, oh goodness, I can't believe I can't remember the name of this college. Not that it matters to anybody else other than me. Fuller Theological Seminary in California, which is typically a conservative, not typically evangelical. It is evangelical, but somehow he got to teach there for years. And he took Lindbeck's ideas and pushed it further and started talking about what comes first, in what order. Do we think we want to do something and then we do it? Therefore we believe that doing something is good. So
is this the I think, therefore I am?
Yeah, taking a Descartes approach, the way that belief how does belief get formed? This is what McClendon's trying to really tackle. Do we see something, believe something, do it? Do we believe something, see something, do it? Believe something, do something, see something? Or do we do it, believe something, and then see something? And his argument is actually that you can't be a good person. Like, you can't believe in good if you've never done good first. And then once you have done good, then you have something to go, was this good or bad? Am I whatever? So he would call the first thing ethics. Like, you have to do the right thing first. And then once you can do the right thing, you can believe something that tells you that it's the right thing. And then to sustain that belief is by witnessing other people doing the same thing. And then my professor, and this is what he did, he took McClendon when he was in seminary, and he took it and he put this little chart, and I'll see if I can find it, because this is the reason why, honestly, this little chart, why so many people that I went to school with went on to major universities of all different denominations, all different sorts, for their PhD programs, for their divinity programs, and were top of their class. This little thing of saying that we act first, and as we act we start to believe, and as we believe we start to do other things, and this comes around. And at the bottom of this chart, this little, I don't even know what to call it, diagram, is all of our communities of reference. So for one specific community of reference, they practice things, and that practice for most of us is where we first get to do blank, where in school we read a book. And as we read a book, we learn that reading is good. When we realize that reading is good, we go, and I'm shortening this up, it's actually much better than what I'm saying, but once we read a book, then we are basically evangelists of saying, oh, isn't reading great? And it comes back down to the beginning of our community of reference, where who we're evangelizing to isn't just to the outsiders, but it's to the insiders, saying reading is great. And because reading is great, we should practice reading.
Yeah.
And the more you read, the more you think. So that's just one community of reference.
This is exactly what I'm going through right now for our youth program that we're developing, or it's already active, but it's just getting bigger, because it's like this worked for us, and this is what we got out of it, and this is how it's applied to companies and jobs and skills that we've learned, and this is how it's related to solving the problems that all of us have, because it's like, how do we get these type of people with this type of skills, which is good for them, they get more money from it, it's like higher value, but it also is something that we've actually intimately experienced, and it's a feeling that's literally changed so many people's lives, and finding how to harness that by this active, it's almost the process of creating something in the world with a bunch of people that are already doing it, but coming together around this idea like you're doing, where it's basically a tree. The leaves fall, it turns into nutrients, and then it feeds the nutrients, and then it grows more leaves, and vice versa.
So are you ready for the problem?
What?
So right now we haven't discussed problems. We've just discussed this is a framework of how we become. And this is not I mean, you said it. This is not new thinking. It's just how I'm describing it is a little bit different.
Yeah.
But if you want to be great at something, you practice the greatness. The more you practice the greatness, you believe in the greatness. And the more you believe in the greatness, you start spreading the greatness. And the more you spread the greatness, you realize, oh, I got to keep practicing. So it's like this circle. Here's the problem. I wanted to be a great guitarist, and I practiced, and I believed in it. I became better than I was, and I talked about it, and I kept on doing it. But then I stopped doing guitar. And I mean, I still believe great things about it and everything. I'm not like against it or anything. I'm not anti-guitarist or anything, but I'm just not a guitarist anymore. The problem is, how do you explain that? Like, we have this community of guitarists. How can we talk about this person who was practicing? They were witnessing, evangelizing guitar, and they were constantly practicing. This is why humans are cool, first of all, and also where also the modern project really breaks down. If we only had one community of reference, everything would be simple, and we just practice what we preach.
Yeah.
And the anomaly, and this is so cool. Like, this is, for me, this is the coolest thing ever. Like, all that stuff is awesome and so great. But the anomaly for a community of reference is another community of reference and another community of reference. And our problem right now, the postmodern project, is that we have so many communities of reference that are not at all in line. So you have a community of reference, and I'm not speaking from my own life, because that would actually, it is a fun project to explore, but it can really beat you up. And this is one reason why when someone tries to convert me, I'm like, okay, until I actually start practicing whatever you're doing, I'm cool. Like, I don't have to worry about you converting me. The problem is that if they accept me into that community, it's harder not to practice. But there is a community I participate in that says guitar, like guitar, practice, believe, preach, practice, believe, preach. But then there's another community I'm participating in. This isn't really me again, that says silence, practice silence. Silence is good because it gives you a rest from the rest of the world, and preach silence. And so you have this thing and you have this thing, and both are partially true for me. I guess I could say this is true for me. Silence is one I've had a harder time practicing than guitar, but they come in conflict because they hit different parts. Every time I practice the guitar, even if I have one of the electric ones and I turn the sound off, I'm still making music, which is not silence. So it automatically disrupts this community of reference every time I am not practicing it. And if it was only two communities of reference, how cool would that be? But we're a part of literally thousands upon thousands of communities of reference. And my professor was saying it in a lens of, you go to church, you go to school, you have your family. If you get married, you have their family. But even in your family, you have two families, that your dad's family, your mom's family. You have your dad's mom, your mom's dad, your mom's mom, not to mention all the splinters that come down. So like what you mentioned earlier of genealogy, and that's just family alone. That doesn't even get into all the other worlds. I'm taking it a step further. Like, this would be my contribution if I ever publish this, but it would be weird because I don't really want to go back and read all the stuff again.
You should.
Yeah.
You can just dictate it and then I'll turn it into a book.
Every person and idea and thought is its own community of reference. So,
I agree. 100% I agree.
And it screws because that means it's impossible to have a true path. But it also makes complete sense, because when I say, if you want to be a great guitarist, you have to practice guitar, every time you practice guitar, you have to practice sacrificing silence, among all these other thousands of things. When you want to lose weight, you have to purposely sacrifice the opportunity to participate in other communities of reference, which completely, and not that this wasn't there 200 years ago, but one of the big things that has come about over the past 20 years is FOMO and YOLO, fear of missing out. You only live once. But whenever there's so many communities that we automatically participate in just by living and being around other people, even if you're like Powder and all you have is books, you're still participating in multiple communities of reference, and they collide with each other.
Yeah, I've got a good example of this, because I used to be in Green Lake crew and I was on the rowing side. One of my best friends was on a kayaker there, and it was both Green Lake, but we had almost like rivalries, and we practiced in different parts and stuff like that. But we were joking about how there was almost this rival, like a not real hate, but just a jokingly hate. But we were still on the same lake. And I think that's the concept with what we grew up, that environment, and what we advocate now is, if you put a bunch of different communities in a similar environment, there's a lot of spillover effects from that, just exposure. So like you said, if you didn't like doing guitar, you could walk next door and try rowing or something like that. And if it's in a similar location, you're not leaving a community. So with you and Toastmasters, like I think you probably stayed in that program a lot longer than you wanted to because of the community. So that's like I like thinking about it in a genealogical perspective because it's something that makes sense. And then if you tie that to a tree, you can think about each of these leaves are like a family or a community. And when the wind blows, the leaves touch each other and you have this interaction. And each leaf or ecosystem has its own ecosystem with it. There's the bugs that live on it and stuff like that. And there's a cycle throughout history where those communities, I don't know if die is really even a right word for it. They have these periods where they fall and they're reborn through the same system, which I think is a general, maybe natural tie, like natural roots that we all have in our shared humanity. And I think there's a lot of people, it goes almost like woo woo and stuff, but you actually see it in the math is how tied people are together, how tied animals are to people, how tied our ecosystems are. It's just a lot of it's just allowing people to show up and have a place where they can express themselves and say stuff and be like, oh, you're Unicorn Batman. That's pretty cool. That sounds actually pretty rad. Thinking about Unicorn and Batman mixed together. It's like with your daughter too. I feel like you've really been very supportive with her in allowing her to explore who she wants to be. And I don't know. There's
even there's so many different layers to this because I know that I've spent a lot of time comparing life to a tree and generations to a tree and stuff.
That's why I was thinking about the acorn to the oak.
Right. And the first time I ever gave that speech, or technically the second time I ever gave that
let's
speech.
give a little background on your book. And
in 2016 or 2017, I don't really even remember, I wrote a book called Becoming Oaks, and it came from another professor where he always used, when he tried to explain Aristotle, he always used the way of talking about that being and becoming, and that the purpose of an acorn is not to remain an acorn, but it's ultimately to become an oak tree. And so the acorn becomes its fullest self when it's an oak tree.
Yeah.
Now there's some things that can be argued about this, and actually this is what I was going to bring up, is that my original speech, the second point, because my Becoming Oaks is the goal is for us all to become oaks. And the first part talks about my life where I went through some different hardships and trials, which are just part of what it means to grow, to set root. When you're first coming out of the ground, just you're facing predators like squirrels, people moving into their yards and stuff. If you don't get enough rain or sun, all these are basic problems that you have. And as you keep growing, like the second paragraph, the second stage that I mentioned was that for the longest time, I thought I was going to be an apple tree and didn't realize I was supposed to be an oak tree. It's not really the point of whether or not I'm an apple tree or an oak tree. And this is the problem. One of the people after the speech said, how do you know you're not an apple tree or an orange tree or another kind of tree? And I was like, okay, I see what I did. I see why I didn't win this contest today. Because as soon as I offered another example of a tree, people could not come back to the oak tree. Because this wasn't a theoretical class on multiverse. This wasn't a treatise on personal identity politics. It was a speech talking, it was an inspirational speech. And as soon as I compared myself to another thing that is not comparable, because as much as apples and oranges aren't comparable, acorns and apples are not comparable.
Yeah.
So I start, and I realized, so I got rid of it, and it completely made the speech a better speech, even though it felt a little bit more dishonest for me, because my issue has always been and this has been my issue my whole life, is how do I become what I'm created to be? What
Mm.
what is my ultimate telos? What is my ultimate goal? What is Mike McVeigh living out his full life? What does that look like? And because I have so many communities of reference, I don't know. And the problem is
Same with
that,
me.
and there's 3 or 4 of us, you, Rob, Brad, myself specifically, that we all joined Toastmasters within a certain realm. And Toastmasters has provided enough of an identity politic for each of us that I would never say, oh, Toastmasters is horrible, I'll never join it again, or I don't see Toastmasters being valuable because I'm not in it anymore, or something like that. I always consider it very important for me. And I think all 4 of us would say that. All 4 of us have become less involved in Toastmasters over the past year or 2. Now, sometimes it's been a wavering thing where it's a season of life. So in this season, I'm not in Toastmasters as much, and next season I'll be back in it. But some of it has been Toastmasters has helped me grow as much as it's going to legitimately help me grow. And I'm not getting into the details of what legitimate or best growth or stuff is, but the kind of growth that Toastmasters would give me is not the kind of growth that I'm exploring right now. That's probably the best way of saying it. I'm looking more in my appleness right now than the Toastmasters acorn.
It's just the world has organizations need to evolve, but also in a way that honors their history and does not replace it. And I feel like Toastmasters, Dale Carnegie, they'll always have a place, but there's a reason why Toastmasters especially has so much growth in the Asian, I think that they call it the ASEAN zone for them, which is basically like Australia to China. And it's because they really have, for the first time, like this, I don't know, middle manager culture is necessarily the thing, but more of a middle class culture that supports the conversational freedom that Toastmasters allows. And I feel that in America, that's what we were built on. And we're still fiercely independent as our identity. But in the US, we've evolved past that. And it's the greatest part of Toastmasters to me now is that I get to go and I get to meet new people, oftentimes that have just moved to our community, and oftentimes also that can't speak English very well. And I get to know about them. They're always super interesting, and I get to learn from them, and hopefully we make them feel welcome here too. But there's
that's actually an interesting side thing right there, is having been at pretty high levels for a district, which is just a group of X amount of people for Toastmasters.
Six leadership roles, correct? Below, oh wait, no, that would be area.
Yeah, so clubs are the basic, or home group is probably a better term that they're going to take a long time to adopt to, and then therefore be even further beyond the curve. But home groups usually are groups between 10 and 20 people. And then usually about 4 or 5 of those home groups make up an area. Usually 3 to 5 areas make up a division. And
so it's like almost having a district manager.
Yeah. And then right now, I think there's 110 districts. I haven't kept up, but approximately 110 districts across the world.
That's a lot.
And then there's some leadership at the highest level that helps. There's 12 people that are the board of.
They run the administrative entity out of Englewood, Colorado.
I believe that's correct, or Colorado Springs or whatever. I don't even know anymore. I've been completely away from it.
It used to be in California for years.
Then they have a CEO that works with the international board to make decisions. District level is generally considered a fairly high level if you're not planning on going into the international level. And even at the international level, they still focus, like the things that they focus the most aren't how to communicate better or how to lead better. Though I know what the argument's going to be as soon as I say what they do communicate. They communicate, be welcoming, be excited about the new people, encourage them and stuff. Now, even though that may lead to better results regarding how to learn how to communicate and learn how to lead, if all you're wanting to do is learn how to lead and communicate better, you don't need any of that stuff.
Yeah.
But it's creating a culture or a language, and what Wittgenstein, who is my favorite philosopher that's not an ethicist, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the 20th century philosopher, Times philosopher of the century, he calls it language games. And so you're playing lots of games together, and that's what gets these communities of reference or these communities of language, and these language games overlap each other. And so even though the goal is to be a better speaker, a better communicator, the language is we need to be inviting to people. And this is something that's pretty much recognized for a lot of groups, that if we want people to buy our product, we're going to encourage them in certain kind of ways. But not all products are that way.
It's hard because I think there's not, let's see. So I think your ideal situation, you have an administrative entity that's small, and then you have all these super well-funded groups. But it's really hard when you have thousands of clubs to force quality control. Like they have a program quality director or club quality director or something like that. And I think I understand why they do it, and I understand why they use those terms, but it's a really good program, but it's hard to be one size fits all. And there's not really a what's next. If you get to a DTM, or even in my situation where I basically have a DTM, but I'm not going to spend the time to go around to clubs and do that stuff. Like, I'd rather volunteer in my community.
Yeah. And see, that's for growth communities. I'm not going to limit it to just nonprofits, but even for businesses that are focused on growth, they all have both the same problem as well as like one of the best problems to have. The best problem to have is that your clients, your students, your community is growing beyond what you're teaching them,
which is the goal.
But once they grow so far, then we don't have a way of keeping them. Yeah. So we create community standards so people who are DTMs or have reached whatever their highest level are, they don't leave. But it's actually a negative thing for the most part, because then it makes people feel guilty. Like there's all these little mind games and stuff. And it's Improv, we do the same thing. We say all positive. If you take a level 1 class, and this is probably any theater you go to, including Chicago, they're going to be like, oh yeah, good job, good job. And then the higher up you go for the other ones, they might be a lot more strict. Ooh, you didn't do so good. But ours,
like you're going to Romanian gymnast coach.
Or Michigan gymnast coach, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or an American gymnast coach. And that's one of my communities of reference, by the way, that makes some things really difficult for the way that things are turning, because I came up with these hard-nosed coaches that yell and cuss at you as a motivational tactic. And I've learned how to respond to that. That can get a better part of me to perform when I have someone that's riding my butt. My daughter, who I love more than anything in the world, does not have a way of being motivated by that.
Yeah.
And we bring this back to politics. We were talking about Biden and Trump, and the way that they're trying to motivate their bases is by yelling and chewing people out.
But you're tapping into their body history.
Oh yeah. For them. And I mean, the thing is, let's be fair. Trump and Biden are partially effective because there's still enough people that can be motivated by negativity or by loud negativity. Because of that, they're able to become a better version of that type of person.
I still it blows my mind. It blows my mind. It blows my mind that they're the two guys, and like even DeSantis too. Like it blows my mind. It's amazing.
And part of it,
live in a movie like this.
Yeah.
This is clearly a simulation. When you get into stuff like this, you're like, oh, like these are the people. This is such a good opportunity for us to actually. Yeah, here you shoot off. I'm sorry.
I think it's partly Arrested Development that it's easier to be motivated by anger and by fear than it is to be inspired by variety.
Yeah.
By acceptance. And I don't remember, it's been so long since we've talked, I don't remember all the things. I think I've told you that I'm trying to read a classic, like every third or fourth book I read, I'm trying to read a classic, whether it's a modern classic or a classic.
Ooh, and awesome.
So I got through all of Jane Austen's stuff back in May and learned a lot about a culture that I really didn't know as well.
Yeah, me neither. But she's great.
Yeah, I was shocked at how much I loved Sense and Sensibility specifically, but because I'd never read it before. The book I'm getting ready to finish, I should be finished with it tonight, is Fyodor Dostoevsky. I can never say his last name correctly, but The Idiot. And it's my first ever Russian fiction that I've ever read, and I love it so freaking much. My wife warned me, she's like, have you ever read Russian fiction before? I was like, no, I've read some Russian history from Russians. I've read some Russian philosophy from Russians, but I haven't really read Russian fiction. And she said it might be a little bit difficult because I don't remember what she ended up reading back then, but she had never read The Idiot. And it just happened to be the first book when I was looking for Russian fiction. And I was afraid it was going to be hard to understand and stuff. And maybe when I read Brothers Karamazov or Crime and Punishment or something, I will feel differently.
I don't think so.
The Idiot is so beautiful, and it's actually ties completely in with what we've been talking about all night. Yeah. And because I was getting close to the book, I wanted to make sure, am I reading this correctly? What am I understanding? Is this accepted as kind of like how people read The Idiot? And it is, first of all. So that made me feel a lot better because like maybe I've been reading something incorrectly. And it's ultimately the story of this guy who they find out later is a prince, but everybody thinks that there's something wrong with him. And an idiot is a more derogatory term than what we're using.
Yeah.
What we've used in America when we talk about mental retardation specifically
retarded
is how they're talking about in idiots. The corner. And this guy is an idiot. Everybody's, there's something wrong with him. And he literally had to spend, not necessarily in a psych ward, but they give a very strong indication that this guy has spent 20 or 15 years with the equivalent of a psychiatrist under a psychiatrist type care. This book was written in the 1800s. So we're not.
They're the people that they started lobotomizing 100 years later, basically.
Yeah. But basically, as you read through the book, you find out the only thing wrong with this guy is he doesn't have a double mind. He speaks his truth.
Yeah.
And he speaks it clearly. He doesn't try to deceive anybody. He thinks the best about people.
Yeah.
He wants people to succeed. And when they say something that disturbs him, he's like, that disturbs me. But I know that you seem to be a good person. So I'm sure that I'm misunderstood. Like those are the kind of words he says. And everybody's, ooh, this guy's simple. He doesn't get it. And I read a review that talks about how this was Fyodor Dostoevsky's most personal work because, and when I'm reading this, and I read that last night, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this was written in the 1800s, where communities of reference and the language games were much more solid than they are now.
Yeah, totally.
Like you knew if you're a prince, you're powerful. Like you're in this power chain. And it's how people react to somebody who's honest. And I still think there's some stuff that's true about that today, which is probably one reason why I love the book so much. I'm actually sad. It's one of those books that I almost want to delay reading for 2 more months because it's so inspiring.
This is my greatest power, is emulating that in real life. As, let's see, so in the tarot cards, or at least the ones that are popular, it's based on Peter Bruegel paintings, essentially, through the plagues and dark ages. There's a character in there called the Fool, which is like based on the court jester. The picture, the Fool has I believe it's like a stick with a cloth bag on the end of the stick, and it's about him just going gallivanting on this journey with justice on his back. And I find it to be the most powerful, or one of the most powerful representations, both then, but also how it was tied historically to the role of the court jester during that time. That's also in a lot of Dutch paintings. My favorite part of, and as a big reason why I went to school in the Netherlands, was literally so I could see the paintings in person all the time. And
that's cool.
And it was, you look at these paintings and it's almost like a thing of Pokemon. If you had all the Pokemon on a scene, but it was like they were at a zoo or something interactive. There was action to it. In many of these paintings, also including a lot of the religious kings and stuff, you see how the artists have utilized characters like the Fool and the court jester, or whatever you call, to communicate this power dynamic visually in a way that the people that control the language don't really fully understand.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But to go back to the greatest power is, nobody expects someone to act like a fool, but also not be a fool, know what they're talking about and stuff like that.
Right.
So you look at someone like Trump, he's harnessed that, but unfortunately he's a narcissist. So there's power in it if you're the one that's allowed to speak the truth, but not get killed by the king.
Now that part is absolutely true.
Yeah.
In fact, my favorite ethicist, Stanley Hauerwas, one of the agreements I made when I got my cats is that I could name my cats whatever I wanted, and I didn't have to feed or take care of them, because I was a dog person growing up. And we bought a brother and sister from the shelter, and I named the girl Aristotle, but Ari for short, and the boy is Hauerwas, Howie for short. If we would have had a third, and it was a boy, which almost happened actually, but the brother had already gotten bought before we could do it. But I was going to name him either Kierkegaard and call him Kierk
nice.
for short, or Athanasius and Athen for short.
Kierkegaard is related to church, correct? And its derivations?
Yeah, he's an interesting person.
I'm talking about the name dialect.
Oh, he was a church philosopher, but an existential philosopher that was friendly to the church, which was really rare during that time. I don't know as much about name etymology and stuff. That's not my background. But Hauerwas, one of his books, I want to call it Dispatches from the Front. I'm pretty sure that was the one. It was the first Hauerwas book I read when I was not in college. I read several of his in college, and I believe it was the first or second chapter, that said, everybody talks bad about gossiping, but gossiping is the only time we ever tell the truth. And
yeah,
now I played with that for a while, of throwing that to people that talk about, I don't like gossiping, let's not gossip. And I was like, oh, so you don't like telling the truth, huh? And
yeah,
it usually makes people uncomfortable at best. They're not ready for that anomaly.
You're like, shh, don't tell anybody, because they won't invite me to their party next week.
And goodness, I can talk about identity politics for a long time. We haven't even scratched the surface, because of, I would say, I want to be careful of calling somebody a master at something while they're still living, especially if they don't. I don't think the people around Trump specifically would ever call him a master at some of this stuff, based on what I've read from a lot of people who have worked around him, including people who are fans. But I would say that one thing that Trump has done better than like 99.999999 people out there is he took one thing, he just went full force at that one thing. And that is something that almost all of us struggle with, is whatever that thing will be. Like my favorite guitarist ever, Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Democrats are horrible at this, frankly.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
No, I feel that they have tried to be like him because he runs with it, and it cheapens a lot of the good things that they do.
Well, and this is the curse of being a Democrat. If you're a Democrat, you're automatically, today's Democrat is that you're supportive. It's more of a big tent than a
fundraising mechanism,
a way of thinking. Whereas Republican is a way of thinking. If you want, if you want to be Republican, this is what you practice. If you want to be Democrat, we can't really tell you what to practice other than don't judge anybody other than Republicans or Christians or other people that are religious fanatics. That's part of the problem with that specific thing. But I'm thinking of, goodness, like Tom Brady or Michael Jordan. I can't put LeBron James up there yet, but the Tiger Woods before his incident. These are people who went after that one thing. And Tom Brady was by no means a great quarterback. Like, he was a above average quarterback who had some good situations around him, but he became the most decorated quarterback in the history of the NFL because he took that one thing and he kept it. And that's one reason why I like these sports stories to an extent, even though Michael Jordan is a complete a-hole to a lot of people, but boy, was he a great a-hole.
He was an evangelist. He was magic when you saw him. And maybe this is a comparison from my childhood, is when the Mariners, when maybe we should
Ken Griffey?
Yeah, when that
Ken Griffey Jr. Oh my goodness.
But Griffey, and I mean, Steve Harvey and Bernie Mac and people like that, they're ridiculous people, but they were just, and Griffey too, the kid, and with his dad, they're like, oh, like, this is, you can actually be like that. You can be normal, you can make mistakes, and you can also acknowledge them. You can deal with a lot of pressure and a lot of expectations, but also just have fun with it. And you can make people believe. I don't know, man.
Yeah, and Ken Griffey Jr. is a great example on multiple levels. The only problem he had, and it's the thing that, because of when he played, was the most corrupt time from players playing the game. And he's literally maybe one of two people, and I'm saying that very loosely. He's the only one that everybody pretty much agrees was not part of the corruption.
Yeah, he was the only.
There's maybe a couple other players that could be put in that same category, but he was the only great one from that whole time period that was not corrupted.
Brett, should we look at a Brett Boone before and after photo to see how he gained
Barry Bonds, Roger
60
Clemens?
Pounds? Yeah,
it's more trying to find the people. Like, Griffey gained some weight as he played, but he gained weight like an old person gains weight, not like a person. When you're playing at 43, like my body at 43, the shape similar to what it was 30, but 33, but it's a lot bigger. I mean, and that's why we love certain authors or certain musicians, is because they found the thing and they just ran with it, and they could. And that's something that also, it's so torturous for the rest of us because we never find the thing.
I think it's because they weren't searching for the thing. It was just something that they were expressing. And they, like, I feel like everybody, maybe people are trying to be everybody else, but if they just focused on being themselves, it would relieve so much anxiety and mental strife. Like obviously you have to deal with the fact that people aren't going to accept you, but if you get to a point where you're hopefully like people always accept you, but if you're 15 or 20 or 30 and you start finding people that are just like, hey, like I went through the same thing and yo, you're super cool. Let's find a way where we can support this in a better way. That's a pretty meaningful.
Yeah, if you can do that. I struggle with that. I find individuals, but I don't find a group. And I can never get those individuals together for various reasons. Like
But
the only thing
but you don't like it's I feel when you get to your own place, because like you were saying earlier, everybody is their own community, right?
Yeah.
And like you're able to dip in and out of these and express yourself and share energy and stuff like that, and then but you're not tied down in a way where this is just what you are. You're still allowed the freedom to evolve and grow.
And the part with growth is always painful. I I struggle right now because several of my largest communities of reference growing up are now very minimal in my life. And the reason why I stopped practicing those traits to be a part of those communities has been weird because part of myself is always going to be tied to those communities of reference. I can never, because we are everything we've done and everything that has been done to us. But I haven't gotten to the point yet where I can be me. And I don't know what being me is yet. And so I'm completely envious of those people, you being one of them, who has a much better idea of what they're, that have gone through enough of themselves that they know, oh, this is part of, this is kind of like a core identity part. The only thing that I do, I try my best. So what other people call core values, which I struggle with that because I understand what they're trying to do. Values is a part of that little paradigm that diagram. I need to find those notes, but values are not something we create and then we like. I believe in honesty, and then we practice honesty. It's we practice honesty, and then we tell stories, and then when we tell these stories about what honesty is, then we start to value honesty, and when we value honesty, we're then able to tell stories outside about honesty, and then we start practicing honesty again. Honest truth telling is something that I continually, it's a value, it's something that I continually practice and I continually do. I try to make integrity one. I struggle a lot more with that one, partly because I don't know who I am.
I
And go
so
ahead.
I just maybe have a different approach to it than you, because I think I
Oh, that's
I think a lot of people almost induce themselves into anxiety thinking that you're supposed to find something that you are, and maybe the whole who we are is the process of finding things. And I feel expectations are the most important things. So if you have expectations or like shared values on certain things, it doesn't matter if there's uniformity, but you could like, if Democrats and Republicans, for instance, took more approach on let's let's do a fundraiser for childhood diabetes or something, where we just show up and let's focus on this one problem, that's a very effective solution. But we really have, I'd say, these two funding vehicles that drive a lot of culture, and it's just I don't know,
yeah, it does.
it's
But
weird.
as I'm trying to find myself, like there's certain things about Stevie Ray Vaughan became like the guitar became an appendage of his. Like he was part of the guitar was part of him.
Yeah.
And the but there's still a point where he still had to say, I'm going to continue playing this guitar even when my brother beats me up for playing his guitar without getting his permission, stuff like that. There was things that he made it so much a part of himself, so then when he didn't think about it anymore, it was still part of him.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because you don't think about it.
And that's what I'm trying to do with integrity, is I'm trying to practice it to a point where I don't have to practice it anymore. It's just part of who I am. It's so core to my web of values that I don't have to think about being a person of integrity. I don't have to practice integrity to be one that does integrity. That it's just part of who I am. And I don't feel like I'm there yet.
It's okay to make mistakes too.
Oh yeah. No, I'm not, and I'm not saying I'm not looking for perfection. That is not one of my values at all, because I don't like practicing perfection. I mean, I've learned, I've dealt with, in fact, that same person I was telling you about that said they can't support trumpets and stuff, or anybody that supports trumpets, like they're really skeptical of them. They happen to be part of one of my groups, Improv, and I don't want to, just for the slight chance that this is what gets heard, I'll just say that an issue came up where, even there at the time there were 6 people in the group. There's 5 of that original 6, and now we have 8. And he asked a question that only 4 other people knew the answer to that were still a part of the group. And 2 of us responded. The other 2 did not. He thought it was, in fact, he even used terminology like tyrant, dictator, that the 2 of us were dictating everything. It's like, no, this was a group consensus, and this is what we decided. And he did a lot of stuff that, I mean, part of it's an immature thing, but even immaturity is a point of reference. I didn't get mad at him.
What is immature?
Because it's learning to be what you're trying to be, whatever that is. And ultimately, it came down to where he kept on throwing stuff in, and I'm like, hey, all right, so let's start over with what's going on here, because our problem isn't the decision. Like, we don't care about if you honor that decision. That's actually a secondary thing. It's the way that you're acting, because we both agreed on this and no one else has spoken up. You're upset that it seems like, in your opinion, that we're trying to control the group. But let's go through it step by step. And I walked through it, and I'm like, you asked a question. We're the only 2 people who answered it. I don't think the 3 new people have a place to answer that. And he agreed with that. And I said, the other 2 people didn't respond. You asked the question again a couple days later. We're the only 2 that responded.
You just didn't like the response.
Right. And so you got mad, and then you put a group poll up trying to find out what everybody else thought. And I said, I felt like that was a unfair thing to do, like a petty thing to do, because you could have just asked the 2 people who didn't respond. But you're posting this in our Discord channel, and like where everybody can see it. And then so I send you a private message, and I included the other person who was a dictator, saying, hey, I feel like you're reacting in a way that's not consistent with what's being said. And it took forever, but went through it all point by point, and it's, okay, this isn't about you. This isn't about the original thing. It's, what is there something going on that's leading you to do this? And I'm really sorry. A couple things have been happening in my life, and he didn't say this directly, but indirectly he was saying, I don't feel like I'm having control over these other parts. And so when the both of you, who are both strong leadership type personalities, told me something different than what I believed or what I thought was right, I reacted against the 2 of you, because it's one of the few places I have control. That's what he was saying. It's not what he said, but that's what he was saying. And he's looking at this. You guys are right. I overreacted. And I gave him a lot of outs. And that's something that was hard for me to learn to do for other people when they screwed up, to give them that chance to redeem themselves.
Yeah, I think it's perhaps an important thing to discuss at this time, because it's a weird time, and maybe it's always been this way, but if you just are perhaps steady Eddie, like I think women especially probably forever have had to deal with this, is because they're perhaps viewed as less dominant, is how do you deliver information that's extremely important in a calm way where people actually understand it. And unfortunately, we've reached supposedly a way where you have to almost do shit like that to even get anybody to respond to you. And it's really a problem. And it's part of the reason that a lot of characters irritate me because they reinforce this thing that you have to call people out publicly if they get any sort of response. And I've personally experienced this a lot in the last couple of years, where the only time that you get anybody to talk to you when you actually have a problem that you need is, unfortunately, in certain situations, is if you talk shit to them. And it's just weird. Like, people don't trust that you're just a nice person, and it almost forces you to have to be something that you're not, just to get them to acknowledge you.
And being idiots, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Idiots in Today's World is both fun, but it's also draining.
The idiot thing is fine, but if you have to be an idiot and also like an aggressive knight where you're out trying to kill people for some kind of bullshit valor thing, when you should be able to just talk to people.
That I'm saying is, I don't think you can be an idiot and also be the knight thing. You mentioned something when we started this, and I don't know how this will get broken up, if this will all be in one or if it'll get separated, but you talked about superheroes, that you're not a big fan of, like superhero movies specifically, but maybe superheroes in general as well. So like the superheroes that I identify with the most are the ones I enjoy the most. There's something, it's kind of like they're that one thing. It goes back to that one thing. Like, one of the reasons why Superman will never be one of my favorite superheroes is because of what his tagline is. It's not because of Superman itself. It's because truth, justice, and the American way. And I don't want the American way to be part of my identity, especially because I don't necessarily like how America is being right now. And so the Man of Steel that came out 10 years ago or whatever, Henry Cavill, bothered me because that's what Americans want. Is that the American way? And it has nothing to do with his acting or anything like that. But Superman is always going to have to react to the American way. That's part of Superman's identity. And anybody that messes with it, it still has to mess with the American way as well. Captain America, though, is someone who I constantly put as someone that's a superhero, like someone who I want to be similar to, because he can just stop with truth and justice. There's no American way, even though he's Captain America, which is a really weird thing that his name is America, but he calls America to the table whenever America does wrong. And sometimes the people of America hate Captain America for that reason. It's not these special traits. Like, so this is why I can't stand Iron Man, for example. It has nothing to do with how cool Iron Man is or how rich Tony Stark is, but ultimately, and this is both comics and movie version, Tony Stark cares more about how he looks to others than anything else. And because maybe I never thought I was good looking.
You're beautiful.
And I've done enough I appreciate that now, but I'm saying growing up, it's harder for me to identify with someone like that. Rocket Raccoon, right up there with Captain America, is one of my favorite. It's because, again, he speaks truth to power, and he's the glue. In fact, he's the only one that
the glue.
And that's what I want to be. And it sucks sometimes to be the glue, because the glue is the hardest thing to keep people together, to try to move forward. But that's when I go back and look at my Toastmasters time specifically. That's what I spent most of my time doing, was speaking truth, fighting for justice, whatever that meant for that time period, and to try to keep my group together while also expanding it. And
people respect you for it still.
And that makes me happy because also is what tears my heart apart, because I love the people of not just Sooner Toastmasters, but because there's still enough of them there that were there when I left, that I hate not being there Thursday nights, but I don't care enough. I hate that phrase too. Right now, the person that I'm trying to be or learning to be,
it's priorities. And
my communities of reference, my values right now, Toastmasters is not the best reflection of those values. That's not against Toastmasters. It's not against that group of people. I love them to death. And it broke my heart a little bit when I found out the group I started with in Toastmasters that not one person who was a member at the time when I started Toastmasters, my very first day to visit, is still in that group. But they're doing better than ever. So it's like also cool.
It's great.
They changed.
Yeah.
My stuff with Improv, I made this joke to my wife the other day, is that in some ways I feel like I'm the unofficial chaplain for Improv, which is such a cool honor, but it's also weird. I don't mean like religious, but just Improv, the way the community is built is not as structured as like Toastmasters or church. So noticing when people have something going on is a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
And I feel in some ways that I'm kind of like the chaplain. I'm like the one that goes and checks in on them. Hey, just wanted you to know, we noticed that you're gone. Hope you're doing well and stuff. And that's tough. It definitely challenges me constantly because sometimes I don't really want to know. I'm like, I'm glad you're gone. But if I feel like and I know this is already a qualification, but if I feel like there's somebody who is worthy, like who's somebody who I want to be in the community, that I think adds something to the community that helps the community be more what they're trying to be, then even if I don't necessarily have a high taste for them, I check in on them. And maybe they'll never come back, and that's fine. Goodness, there's literally hundreds of Toastmasters who I checked in on who never came back to Toastmasters. But they always remember that there was a guy or a few guys from Toastmasters who cared enough to check in on them even a couple years down the road, just saying, hey, I know you used to work for Remington Park. Are you still doing that, or you moved on?
Yeah. That you even remember them.
Yeah. Being remembered is so, wow. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Isn't it cool that we've literally talked for 2 hours without provocation?
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome.
I'm more worried about you because I could probably go on for another 6 hours.
I'm pretty tired, but let's talk for a little bit longer. I think everything that we've talked about today is very, I guess, on topic for a lot of the stuff that I've been thinking a lot lately. It's just real quick. I saw this video on Big Think a while back, and it's called Psychologist Debunks 8 Myths of Mass Scale, Todd Rose. And it's about the series talking about collective illusions. And Todd Rose I don't remember what his company's name, but it has at least this video. It's one of 11 that they did together. He talks about 8 myths, like one, that other people can't be trusted. So they use an example of, it was like a telemarketer survey where they called people up and were like, go find a coin. If you flip a heads, then you win a gift card. And people would flip their own coin and say whether or not they got heads or tails. They could lie, but when they looked at the results, it was basically 50-50. So it fit the natural distribution that you would expect probability wise. So that essentially proves in itself that people can be trusted, especially on like little stuff like that. The second myth that they had, success is wealth, status, and power. People care about very different things. Third myth, social media reveals what society thinks. And I think this is one of the biggest problems with public service these days, is a lot of policies are literally based on things that most people don't want to be a part of, and also is mostly bots. So if you literally know what the data models these people run stuff off of, you can buy bots to funnel stuff in there and then push opinion either way And it's just like a crazy thing. Pretty much everybody thinks that social media is crazy, and that's part of the point. So it's like watching car crash videos. There was another myth: America's on the verge of civil war. And I agree with this, but also disagree with it too. Civil war, to actually get to a point where we'd be fighting like house to house, that just sounds totally ridiculous to me. But on an administrative level, there are people fighting over the control of the country club right now. And that's pretty obvious. And it's really pretty ridiculous. But I think generally, like, nobody really cares. They just want to live their life and hang out with people that they love. And then there's two other myths. People want university degrees. The myth is that people do not want university degrees. They want jobs. And there hasn't really been a lot of kind of these pathway programs that really provide a clear pathway besides going to universities. So I think like generally people think it's broken. And then myth: cultural norms exist to protect you. I think I was curious about that with you. Cultural norms exist to protect you, because this was saying that back in the day, whether it be maybe how religions were or just even your castle, there was a lot more threats to your life back hundreds of years ago that force you to have cultural norms that would force you into groups for survival level instincts. And now that we live in a place where it's safer than ever, we have the freedom, but we're almost afraid to be free as a society because we have this long history of cultural norms that we live in kind of a fiefdom area. And so
I agree with it was dangerous, maybe physically back in the day. So the culture was there to protect. But I would still say cultural norms are meant to protect. The problem is that we don't live in a culture as much as we live in we live in a culture of cultures within cultures, that to be a good Toastmaster, everything that's in there is to protect you as a Toastmaster. It might cut. So when I'll switch this to something that I can actually say something on more, like weightlifting or getting fit. If your goal is to build mass, doing aerobic exercise lessens your gains, period. This is scientific fact. If you want to be the most fit that you can be, doing weightlifting and stuff, like the balance of it is skews towards more of an aerobic style as opposed to the anaerobic style of lifting. But for most people, it's going to be somewhere in between. We're not trying to be Mr. Universe or Miss Universe or All Universe. We're trying to maybe put on a little bit of muscle while also losing our fat, being healthy enough that our doctor will quit giving us recommendations for stuff. But to be a bodybuilder, those are norms to protect you as a bodybuilder, but it doesn't mean it's the most healthy. It's not protecting you in ways outside the culture. All that to say, whichever culture, those norms are there to protect you as long as you partake in that specific culture.
yeah.
But as soon as you step out of that culture, those norms may or may not, just depending on what culture you're stepping into.
Like, I think a good example is the Mormon Church. I'm just saying, like, I'm not, let's see. No, just for like younger kids, they advocate having a lot of kids because it grows members of the church. So there's a lot of resources available to encourage that the members of the church have subsidized access to food and stuff like that, so that they're allowed to have a lot of kids. And I think it's a good point like that, where if you're a part of it, it protects you, but you also have to give up a lot of your personal freedom to exist within that identity too.
You sacrifice other things to be able to take on that thing
for safety.
And in a completely different weight loss community, different than getting fit, but just to lose weight, you have like anemia and bulimia and stuff. And those things are very unhealthy for you as a person.
You mean cutting?
Cutting
I'm just joking.
Well.
I was talking about cutting weight, not.
Well, that
a lot of people justify it. So
yeah, but when the purpose is to be at a certain weight or to look a certain way, it for the purpose of that culture,
yeah,
those norms protect you. It doesn't mean it protects you from everything else. And this is why university is such a because university, the other myth is really it proves the last point wrong, because if you support the university culture about what the university is supposed to do, then as long as people keep on saying, oh no, go to university, you get a job, that's the way it works, then it's not untrue. It doesn't mean you're always going to get a job. It doesn't mean everything's going to work out perfectly. But if you don't go to university, you're not going to get a job or this kind of job.
Well, so let's break that down too. University broken apart is universe, which means single verse. It's like a single frame reference. So like in the Dutch culture, they have the Hodge school system, which has different universes where they focus on different kind of skill groups. And yeah,
even small. My daughter actually asked me this the other day, which I was like, yeah, you asked a great question. What's the difference between OC and OU?
Yeah,
because cost is no longer the reason. And I said, OC is they call it community college, but what it is, it teaches you stuff like the basics of how to go further into a certain school of thought. Yeah. So that school of thought might be the school of medicine or the school of journalism or the school of theology or the school of music. But a university has a bunch of colleges who are schools of thought, and they bring it all together in one central thing, and they allow you to get credit for some of these other courses. So you can take a course in social psychology, which will fit both the School of Psychology and the School of Sociology, a credit for both of them.
Yeah.
And then depending on which school you come from will depend on how much you like the teacher who comes from that other school. Yeah. And I guess this is one of the things that's so cool, but also so weird, because you and I grew up in a different world where
maybe, can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
Does she prefer being instructed or taught? Because this is, I would say, the definition, the breakdown that people are making in education right now from, I don't know if they're doing it in education, but from the outsiders that fund education looking at it, is the differentiation between instruction and teaching. In instruction, you're instructing people how to view a certain universe, while teaching is teach a man to fish. They can fish for a lifetime. And that's more of a Votech school where they're doing and also learning fundamental skills that allow them to potentially express themselves in different ways.
Yeah. Colleges, it's tough because I think most professors who teach a practical discipline legitimately do it because they want to have more students to learn how to think,
like
and
home,
stuff like that.
Home economics and stuff like that.
And part of it's also going to depend on the teacher or the professor, because I've taken, and I love this with improv, I've taken a level 2 class for myself once as a student, and I've been a teacher's assistant to 2 other people who have taught the level 2 class. So I've had 3 teachers teach the same class, and they all do it for a different reason. They all have a different, dare I say, agenda
Yeah.
for what they do, how they do, why they do. I don't think any of them are wrong, but I know which ones have typically, and probably level 1 is a better example, but I don't do level 1 on purpose. But the ones who seem to have stayed longer have been the ones that it's more of just, hey, let's have fun. Or maybe I would say the
Yeah.
instruction. Getting the free meal, getting that fish is a nice meal. But the ones who I go, ooh, these are ones who really get it. They're the ones who were taught as opposed to instructed.
Yeah.
And so,
Totally.
but that's also part of the problem of all these little communities and stuff. The ones who generally take positions of power are the ones who were taught, not the ones who were instructed. Not always, but the ones that we like aspire to. So Toastmasters, I'm not going to name any names, and I don't want you to name any names. But if you think about even at the club level or any higher for the parts that you've participated in, the ones who are aspirational, inspirational, the ones that you're like, man, that's the kind of person I want to be, they were the ones who were generally taught. The ones who might do a great job, but they're more.
Carol Dean is a
For that one, I don't mind giving examples of people that we want to be like. Those are that's a good thing. But the ones who generally seek positions of power, who have not always been impressive. I'm not going to say they did a bad job, but just they're not ones I want to emulate.
Yeah.
I would argue that most of them have been instructed. And
there's
at the time,
it's the biggest issue is that business is dominated by MBA types. And it's because they went to school to learn a checklist and they follow a checklist, but that's very devastating. Like I've talked about a lot at Baker, there would be these people that would just, you had no choice because they're way above you, but you would be like, if you fire these people, it's going to destroy our business and it'll take us years to recover. Or this customer pays us $15 million a year. And the only reason that they work with this is because it's one person and you're saying we have to fire them. And then they just lay them off. And then they complain 3 months later of why your revenue dipped. And you're just like, yo, like people aren't all just labor inputs. This isn't just a checklist that you learn at school and you follow. It's more of like a feeling aspect.
Yeah. And I would say most people prefer to be instructed in most areas, but they only want to be taught in specific areas. Because being taught also means that you're willing to sacrifice on your own to learn, whereas being instructed is you do what's necessary to get by. Now, maybe you might have to be getting by with an A, and that's obviously going to require a higher level of work than a D. But ultimately, as long as you get by at that whatever level you're going for, because I would say most of the professors when I was going through the School of Theology and Ministry, they were the kinds of guys and ladies that you wanted to be like.
Yeah.
And so several of them, which is even funnier because of
that's a linguistic discipline too, though, which fits more, I think, in the university environment.
But I'm thinking of Bible colleges or some other universities at the same time who I had friends going to. And we even had a couple of professors at my time that they were fun, but no one really wanted to be them.
Yeah.
But they gave, and I won't lie, I mean, the dude has given me more things that I can reflect back, but he didn't ever he was so focused on practice and he explained enough to us that he thought was necessary for us to understand, but didn't really want to explore why we do some of the stuff we do and what kind of people are we that does this. And the thing is that it's always better to give trophies than rats, to give attaboys the negative things. And that's absolutely true. It's not a question of that. But the reason why we do it is just as important as about what we do. And he didn't want to focus on why, he wanted to focus on what. And the professors that all of us enjoyed the most, and I say all of us, were the ones who could talk about the what and the why. And then what they challenged us to do was, how do we do that?
Yeah.
They didn't just, and of course they're the ones who I'm painting them in a heroic way, because they didn't just tell us how to do it. They said, these are ways we've done it, but these might not work for you. But this is what we do. Here's why we do it. So how do we do this? And that was our challenge constantly. So when I think about things through those lenses, I'm always more, okay, how does Toastmasters, when I was a part of it, how do we accomplish the what, but also the why? I don't want people just to be better speakers and leaders. That's not enough. The reason why I want them to become better speakers and leaders. And then how do we challenge people? And I'm not saying I've always been successful in that, because I don't think I have. But I also think that there's a couple people in person I'm thinking of off the top of my head is someone like Anne, who is just an amazing person.
Yeah, she's badass.
And I don't, and she very much wanted just to come for the how, but she started to really buy into the why. And unfortunately, she had it at a tough time, but she's figuring out how. And she's constant. And she's not the only one, but that's exciting for me. That's almost makes me want to go back just to see that. Julia as well, who has really embraced, I'm not just doing this because this gives me credits for my DTM, my Distinguished Toastmaster Award, but this is something I do care about. And that's almost attractive enough to have me come visit, but I don't want to get people's hopes up.
And Julia and Julia both have unique personalities that, and I think perhaps they grew up in times and in locations where that wasn't necessarily appreciated as much as we appreciate it now. So you're seeing them blossom, and it's hard not being there, because it's one of the cool things. Before Anne did her speech for the state championship, she came over to Carol Dean's house with me and did the speech there. So I got to watch it and give her feedback. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. But she's like my friend, but she's also the age of my mother, not as old in that generation. It's not a
generation I'm in, by the way.
It's not, you know what I'm saying? Like,
I do. I know what you mean. Just keep going.
Yeah. I'm trying to say this nice.
I understand.
Or in a way that's interpreted nice, because it is nice. And
you don't mean any harm.
I respect her history and her experience and all of that. And to be in a point now where that it's like the comparison, diamonds. A diamond is put under all this pressure and heat for all these years, and then it becomes diamond, and then it comes out of the ground, and then you wash it up a little bit, and then it sparkles. And to see someone that's had all that experience, like Carol Dean too, have all that experience, and then find a way where they can communicate that. And it's an evolution that you watch over time, is how they communicate that story in a supportive environment. It's really magical.
Yeah.
To be able to share that with people.
And I completely agree. And I celebrate the victories that they have. I like the legacy that they continue of what it means to be a Sooner Toastmaster.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe that's where we should just end it. I'm just really happy for the growth that they've had. And I'm so happy that the challenges that they and several of the other members in that group have had to get to the point where they finally are hoping they feel loved and accepted. and that they have a voice. That is another thing that Sooner Toastmasters does better than most of the other groups I've been a part of, is that whatever your political leaning is, you don't get punished for it. There's people on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, and it's not allowed, like, it's one of the few things that you're not allowed to talk about in Toastmasters is politics and religion.
That's not true.
And for the speeches,
no,
I'm pretty sure.
I can guarantee you. I've read those bylaws more than anybody probably else.
Maybe I'll have to lose another bet with you on this.
I'm performing next Friday night, 7:30.
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny.
I'll be dressed up as a man-animal.
Manimal.
A druid, yeah.
Before we go, since we usually talk about content here, usually news and stories like that, definitely not related, but some of the stuff that I've really found interesting is Van Neistat is a YouTuber, is Casey Neistat's brother, and he posted this great video called Why Some of Us Only Think in Pictures. And it's about object visualizers. What an object visualizer is. Do you have an object visualizer brain? And a lot of your engineers and like people that are good with Lincoln Logs and stuff like that are object visualizers, and they struggle in school. A lot of people who are dyslexic, I believe, in my opinion, as not a scientist, are also object visualizers. Literally, some of the best business people I know are dyslexic, and they're much better business people because of their dyslexia. And it's just a weird thing. They're unable to read out of a book and follow a checklist. So what is a lot of people that watch YouTube as a way to see and then work through it themselves and build stuff, a lot of those people are probably in this object visualizer group. But I think this is a really interesting thing that people should check out. And then check out 1995 ALDS Game 5. Ken Griffey Jr. scores game-winning run to send Mariners to the ALCS. MLB.com. This is the greatest. This is actually on my birthday, October 8th of 1995. So I was 11 years old. I remember exactly where I was sitting. We were sitting in our living room. We had brought the TV in and put it on top of this brown little coffee table sort of thing. And my family was there for my birthday party, and we were all sitting around watching this. And the entire generation of Seattle kids still think about this moment all the time. Ken Griffey Jr. is the greatest baseball player that has ever played
in Seattle.
Ever played, ever. He just had injury issues. And he is the Michael Jordan of baseball, but better and a better person than Michael Jordan too. No offense, but
probably the better person part might be accurate, but that's about it out of most of what you said. So books I've read over the past 2 months that I think are worth checking out or buying. And I'm always careful about giving book recommendations because the way I rate books is usually different than most other people. But this was meant for people who have kids who have different issues, but it's actually a book about
learning impediments or what?
Anything from dyslexia to kids who just can't concentrate, like ADHD, maybe a kid with a deformity. Just it covers a lot of things, but it's called Shut Up About Your Perfect Kid, a survival guide for ordinary parents of special children. And I look at it more as a way of embracing normal.
Yeah.
There's some WWE books, but if you're not a fan of wrestling, then it's probably not going to be that great.
Can you tell us which ones and who they involve?
Yeah, this one, I'm a huge wrestling fan. I don't pay attention to the details as much now, but I love the lore and what kind of culture wrestling creates. Yeah. But the book, the one out of the two that I would really recommend is called Nitro, The Incredible Rise and Inevitable Collapse of Ted Turner's WCW by Guy Evans. It's a fun book. Some of the ones that have been written about WCW's history has been very technical, but this one is a fun kind of spin and does some cool stuff.
By the way, I've, like, a lot of people talk about the New World Order or whatever. I've wondered.
NWO.
Yeah, exactly. I've wondered how much of people's conspiracies now are based on the fantasy games that they played back in the 90s. So it's just funny that sometimes these wrestling things that you play become part of your linguistic narrative 20 years older related to different things.
The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank.
Cool.
A brilliant book. I guess most of us grew up on the play as opposed to the actual book, and talking about someone searching for what they envision life to be when they get older. And I know it's a tragic book because she died when she was 16 and the way she died and stuff, but it's a beautiful book on the insight of a teenage girl who I honestly believe several of us can identify even at an older age. And then, even though I haven't finished it yet, The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. That's the only 5-star book out of all these ones that I've mentioned. Though Shut Up About Your Perfect Kid is pretty close. It's like a 4.5.
Since Anne Frank is so popular, what sort of insights was she dissecting that you found specifically relatable to something that either you think about a lot or you see a lot of people deal with?
So most of the diary, not all of it, but most of the diary was written when they were hiding from the Nazis. And there's times that it transcends the look of what was going on, that she was just a teenage girl in the midst of these horrible times of crisis, how we see people. And she writes just enough entries about the people she lived with, of how she viewed them as a 14-year-old girl, as a 15-year-old girl, and as a 16-year-old girl. And most likely those people were basically the same, but how someone who's going through puberty and stuff at the same time, how that helped in learning how to be a human.
Yeah, that would be crazy.
It would have been interesting to see what she would have been had they gotten out of Nazi Germany or gotten past Nazi Germany. To see, she made some statements like of how she did not feel that she was going to be like her mother or her sister, who they find their person identity in being a mother or being a wife, but that she thought she was going to find it in being a writer, specifically a journalist.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, she was writing this as a 16-year-old girl in 1944, really right at the heartbeat of right before women's lib came up. So this is still fairly radical language. She talks about what her dad's life was like, who was a rich man. He grew up as a rich person, like his family was rich. Then they lost it all and he had to build back up from nothing. So it's just insights of how, especially since I'm definitely not a girl, I have never been a girl, and as far as I know, don't plan on being a girl. It's interesting just to hear the female perspective, but I still reminisce of, there's parts where she gets really upset at somebody for whatever. And then she goes back into her diary and I overreacted because I'm forgetting that what they're going through.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Especially for what we've been talking about tonight, so the person from Improv who I had to go point by point with, it would have been easier to just say, screw you, you're out of the group, or screw you, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. But to know that I really do believe this as a whole, and I think Anne Frank's diary highlights this, that the people who complain, most of them are complaining because they care.
Yeah.
Not because they're trying to be an a-hole. There are a few a-holes that complain just to complain, but there's something, when I complain, I'm not talking about, I don't want to use the word where you're just griping for griping purpose. I'm not talking about griping. I'm talking about complaining. Like when you complain, it's generally because it's something that sets you off. This isn't right, that there's something unjust about this. And especially when someone goes off big time, whatever that might be, it's because part of their identity feels attacked. And sometimes, not all the time, unfortunately, sometimes we can find a way to resolve an issue by finding out what's being attacked and then using a different tactic to converse or to communicate with that person.
Yeah.
Sometimes, unfortunately, the being attacked is so overwhelming that they can't separate, like and this, I feel bad because I feel like this is hitting a bit closer to home for some stuff right now, but when we're silent about things that we gripe about to others, it's because we're so afraid of that if we complain, that the people that we would complain to won't realize that that we care. So I'm afraid to say something to you, Matt. No, I'm not, but if I'm afraid to say something to you because you might hear it as a complaint and think that I don't care about something, by staying silent and then saying something to someone else, oh, Matt, blah, 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 that does multiple harm because now I've harmed you by not being honest with you as a friend. I've harmed myself, and I've harmed the person who I gripe to. Whereas if I told you, like, hey, Matt, there's an issue, you're not reading enough books. And you're like, screw you, man, I read 5 books today. Yeah, but you're not reading enough. And you might get upset.
And you're like, those are primers for children and they take 3 minutes a piece. Those don't count.
I don't know. I count them. But it's hard. It's hard to sacrifice being right and winning, for at least for me it is, to be able to say you as a person. And I still might disagree with you about something, but to be able to still sacrifice and say, hey, I've obviously hit some kind of trigger, or I've stepped on a button. I've done something that's upset you beyond what we're talking about, because you don't really care that I support Trump, or you don't really care that I support Biden. You care about something else that's related to that. So let's talk about that. Let's get that resolved. And it's hard. It's just hard.
Yeah.
Because it's draining. But man, now if it weren't that I have 3 books I was planning on reading this week, I'm like, I want to go back and read a couple of these other books.
Yeah. I think like you get to a point where you're just like, you can do whatever you want, but if you don't tell me what you think, you're not one of my best friends. And it's hard when people gossip behind your back, but then not to your face, and you never get an opportunity to address it. It's so with the boat, this is a random thing, but this is more of like a concrete example, perhaps, with the boat shop. Like, not to go into that sort of stuff, but it was like we were never given a chance to buy it. Essentially, it was all sold in secret, and the person that bought it insisted on having a legal gag order and stuff like that. So by the time it was there, we could have actually, my dad could have gotten maybe twice as much from us through our plan, but we were never given an opportunity to even buy it. They just did this shifty thing behind the back, and it was hella illegal too. And this company basically stole our family's business, and I had the money to buy it, and I had a partner that was going to work with me. So it was just like this thing where it was just, yeah, I'm trying to think. It's just not good to be scandalous. And yeah.
And for the sake of, because I think this is a cool thing, if anybody wants to read with me, my next 3 books that are not improv related that I'm going to be reading, if you guys want to read along. Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. It's a modern classic, so I figure I've watched the TV show. Let's see how much better the book is. which I didn't realize was only written in 1983 or 84.
Yeah.
I already know it's going to change my whole perspective now that I know what year it was written. Calm Clarity, Mindfulness for a Life of Peace and Flourishing by Marty Michelson. He was my Old Testament professor, and I have a feeling that this is a non-religious book, which is interesting.
Sweet.
Especially for some of the conversations you and I have been about, especially like with Spencer and stuff in the past. And then the third one is by my friend, Dr. Jonathan Lafferty, but in the way it's written in the book is Jonathan Lafferty. Feld. The movie, the unauthorized novelization. And if I remember right, it's a Seinfeld-inspired choose your own finale spy parody. And it has 37 different endings when it's made for adults.
That's kind of cool.
So I'm supporting two people I know, plus reading a more recent classic, and I hopefully have all that done before July 1st.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what I'm reading. A lot of art biographies I've read before. And then, let's see, I read a lot of books over and over again. Fans First by Jesse Cole. And he's the guy, Savannah Bananas.
Okay.
That's a great book. And they got a cool thing going on. So everybody should check that out.
What's the dude's name?
Jesse Cole. Jesse Cole. I'm just trying to think. Like, I'm looking at bookcase. What have I read recently? There's a monocle book on retail space design that's not really a novel or anything, but that was really cool. I'm enjoying that a lot. It basically has a lot of photos from different shop locations all over the world. So a cool one is a hat maker in Chicago, and it talks about their craft and stuff like that, and it's pretty cool. Probably not. I'm trying to think what else. That's probably it for now. I have this old Civil War Chronicles book that I bought in Tennessee years ago, and it has first person accounts from either side of the war, and it goes through a timeline progression sort of thing. So it's almost a bunch of little essays, but thought about spending some time with that recently too. Yay. All right, it's 11:02 p.m. Signing off. Matt and Mike. Peace out.
If you would like to learn more about the New Next podcast, find us at thenewnextpodcast.com, where you can suggest a topic you would like for us to cover. If you enjoyed what you heard, share the podcast, tell a friend about it, or rate us with 5 stars.